You people always try this. Take off that ratty watch and give me your boarding pass again. Real ones don't look like they came out of a pawn shop. Everett Hale didn't move his wrist. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Lila Sloan the way you look at a storm cloud that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to break. That was the moment. Before the slap. Before the torn boarding pass. Before the phone call that would cost Continental Crest Airlines $41 million before the sun came up over Seattle. Before any of that, there was just a woman standing in the aisle of a Boeing 787 and a man in seat 2A who refused to disappear. Rewind. Detroit Metro Airport, Gate A34. Early morning. The smell was jet fuel and burnt coffee, and the particular staleness of recycled air that hasn't cycled yet. Everett stood in the boarding line with a scuffed brown duffel over one shoulder, a gray hoodie zipped to the collar, and a pair of New Balance sneakers that had seen years of daily wear. On his left wrist sat a Timex with a cracked crystal face, the second hand frozen, the leather band gone soft and dark with age. It didn't tell time anymore. He wore it anyway. The gate agent scanned his pass without looking up. First class. Seat 2A. Flight 21 to Seattle, Tacoma. Everett walked down the jet bridge the way he walked through every room he'd ever entered. Quiet, unhurried, taking up exactly as much space as he needed and not 1 inch more. He didn't know yet that a woman would rip that boarding pass in half and throw the pieces into his lap. He didn't know that dozens of strangers would watch it happen and say nothing. He only knew that his mother's stroke rehabilitation appointment was coming up, and he wanted to be in Seattle in time to walk her into it himself. Everett Hale grew up in a rented duplex on Woodward Avenue in Highland Park, 4 blocks from a Ford plant that closed the year he was still a boy. His mother, Odessa Hale, cleaned offices downtown from early morning until noon, then worked at a discount grocery until closing. Her knuckles cracked in winter. She smelled like bleach and Jergens lotion and exhaustion, and she never once, across all the years of raising him, called in sick. His father, Samuel Hale, drove a delivery truck for a regional freight company. He died at the wheel on I-75 when Everett was still a child. A heart attack. The truck drifting into the median. No other vehicles involved. The company sent a card and a check for $200. Odessa never cashed it. She kept it in a kitchen drawer for years until the drawer swelled shut from humidity, and she finally threw the whole thing away, check included. After that, Everett became the one who carried the groceries up 2 flights of stairs. Because his mother's knees had started giving out, he learned to fix the radiator that clanked all winter. He learned that nobody was coming to fix things for you, and that if you wanted something to work, you had to be the one who made it work. I was accepted into the University of Michigan on a full scholarship, majored in industrial engineering, and graduated early. Because another year of tuition wasn't something his mother's paycheck could stretch to cover, scholarship or not. His first job was loading freight trailers at a distribution hub on Detroit's east side. $11 an hour. Long shifts. Supervisors who called the workers by last name only and never bothered learning the first ones. He lasted more than a year. Not because he quit. Because he noticed the routing software was sending trucks out half empty on return legs, burning tens of thousands a month in wasted fuel that nobody upstairs seemed to be tracking. He wrote it up on his kitchen table over several nights, printed it at the public library because his apartment didn't have a working printer, and handed it to the regional director. The company implemented every recommendation. It saved them hundreds of thousands in the first year. Everett got a 35-cent raise. That was the night he decided he would never again build something and hand the profit to somebody else. He started iron-clad logistics holdings with one truck, a used International he bought for $9,400, financed through a credit union that almost said no. He drove it himself for the first stretch of years. Detroit to Columbus, Columbus to Cincinnati, back to Detroit, sleeping in the cab, doing his books on a laptop wedged against the steering wheel. Within a few years, he had 11 trucks. Within more, he had 90. Eventually ironclad, Logistics Holdings was a multi-billion-dollar company with thousands of employees, a fleet of hundreds of vehicles, and long-haul contracts with 4 of the 6 largest commercial airlines in the country. He sat on 2 corporate boards. He'd turned down a state commerce appointment the year before, not out of disinterest, but because he didn't trust a title to let him actually do anything. He funded scholarships quietly through a foundation that didn't put his name on the letterhead. He still lived 20 minutes from the duplex he grew up in. He drove a several-year-old Ford Explorer. He wore the same rotation of 5 hoodies, and on his left wrist, every single day, he wore a watch that hadn't told accurate time since he was a boy, because his father had been wearing it the morning he died, and the paramedics had given it back to Odessa in a plastic bag, and Odessa had given it to Everett on his 18th birthday, and said, "This is the only thing of his that survived the truck. Take care of it." He never used his wealth as a weapon. Not in boardrooms. Not in restaurants where hostesses seated him near the kitchen. Not in the country club where a member once asked if he was there to detail the cars. He saved that weapon for people who left him no other choice. That morning, boarding the flight, Lila Sloan was about to become one of those people. Lila Sloan had been a flight attendant for years, the last stretch of them as lead cabin crew for Continental Crest Airlines. And in that time, she had built a private taxonomy of passengers that she never wrote down anywhere but followed with the precision of scripture. There were passengers who belonged in first class, and there were passengers who had somehow gotten a first-class ticket. She could tell the difference, she believed, within a few seconds of eye contact. She'd grown up in a working-class suburb outside Cincinnati, the daughter of a machinist, and had spent her entire adult life climbing one meticulous rung at a time toward a version of respectability that felt to her perpetually one insult away from being taken back. She policed the cabin the way some people police their own front lawns, obsessively, defensively, as though its condition were the only proof she had that she'd made it somewhere. She was, by most accounts, good at her job. Efficient, punctual, warm to the passengers she'd already decided deserved warmth. Sterling Ashby, seated in 2C that morning, got a glass of champagne before the door even closed, and a "wonderful to have you back with us, Mr. Ashby," that suggested history between them. Nobody checked his boarding pass twice. Everett in 2A got nothing. Not a greeting, not a drink. Just a long look at his hoodie, his sneakers, the duffel he'd stowed himself without waiting for help, and a boarding pass she scanned with visible reluctance, as if the machine itself might be wrong. "This says first class," she said. Not a question. An accusation dressed as a question. "It is first class," Everett said. "Seat 2A. She studied the pass longer than any scan required. Then she handed it back and walked away without a word, which was, in its own way, the opening move. Watch what happens to that watch on his wrist. It's going to come up again, and not in the way you'd expect. The first tear came once the seatbelt sign clicked off. Lila moved through the cabin with the drink cart, pouring champagne for Sterling Ashby, coffee for the woman in 2B, orange juice for the elderly couple in row 1. She reached Everett and set nothing down. "Can I get you something?" She said it flat, already 3/4 turned away. The way you ask a question you don't want answered. "Coffee, black." She poured it. barely 2 inches in a cup that should have held 6, and moved on before he could say thank you. Small. Deniable. The kind of thing you could explain away in a training review as an oversight. It wasn't an oversight. It was a test to see how much he'd tolerate before he made a scene she could then point to as proof of the thing she'd already decided about him. I tolerated all of it. He drank the 2 inches of coffee and opened his laptop and reviewed a freight contract for a distribution center in Tacoma. And if the thin coffee bothered him, nothing on his face showed it. The second tier came later, and this time it wasn't deniable at all. Lila stopped at his row, hand on her hip, voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the rows around them without quite being a shout. The volume of someone who wants an audience but wants deniability about wanting one. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move to economy." Everett looked up from his laptop. "I have a first-class ticket, seat 2A. I understand that's what it says, but we've had a request from another first-class passenger who'd feel more comfortable, and I think it would go smoother for everyone if you just came with me." There was no other passenger. There was no request. Sterling Ashby, 3 feet away in 2C, lowered his phone and frowned, because he had said nothing, requested nothing, and knew exactly what he was watching. "I'm not moving," Everett said. 3 words, delivered with no heat at all. Something in Lila's chest tightened at the stillness of it. Not fear exactly, but the particular offense of watching someone refuse to perform the anxiety she expected to see. She had built her whole authority on people flinching. He wasn't flinching. "You know," she said, leaning down until her face was a foot from his. "In all my years doing this job, I have never once had to explain to a paying customer why a man dressed like he walked in off the street is sitting in the seat. A seat they paid $4,000 for. So you're going to want to make this easy on both of us." Everett set his laptop down slowly, closed it, and folded his hands in his lap. "Call your captain if you need to. I'm not moving." The third tier arrived moments later, and it left a mark that lasted considerably longer than the flight. Lila reached across the armrest, snatched the boarding pass from where he'd tucked it into the seatback pocket, and tore it down the middle in one motion. She threw the 2 halves into his lap. "Get up now before I call security and have you in cuffs on the tarmac in Seattle." The cabin went dead silent, in the particular way that only dozens of strangers holding their breath at once can produce. Somewhere behind row 4, a service cart wheel squeaked once against the aisle carpet, and then stopped, as if even the machinery understood something had shifted. Everett picked the torn halves of the boarding pass off his lap, set them neatly on the armrest, and looked at Lila without blinking. "I already told you," he said. "I'm not moving." She slapped him. Open palm. Full arm. The kind of contact that isn't a warning shot. It's a decision. The sound cracked through the cabin, like something structural giving way. And for several full seconds afterward, nobody in the cabin moved. Not the elderly woman in 1B who'd been knitting. Not Sterling Ashby, whose mouth had fallen open. Not the 2 flight attendants frozen at the galley curtain. The recycled cabin air seemed to hold the sound the way water holds a stone after it's already sunk. The ripples long outlasting the splash. Everett didn't touch his cheek. The left side of his face was already reddening, a raised welt forming in the shape of her hand. But he sat with his hands folded exactly as they had been, and he looked at Lila Sloan. The way you look at weather. Something unpleasant that would, eventually, pass. He reached into his duffel, pulled out a small spiral notebook with a cracked plastic clasp, and clicked a pen. "Your name?" he said. "I already read it off your badge. L. Sloan. I want to confirm the spelling." Lila's hand was still tingling. Some part of her recognized distantly that something had just gone permanently wrong. But the larger part of her, the part that had spent years being right about people, pushed the recognition back down. "You provoked this," she said. "I'm writing you up as a security threat. When we land, you're getting escorted off in restraints, and we'll see how funny that little notebook is then." "Write whatever you need to write," Everett said. He wrote the time in his own notebook. He wrote her name. He wrote the seat number. Then he pulled out his phone, opened his contacts, and typed a single message to a name saved as Victor Callahan. "Ironclad legal. Need the board on a call tonight. All 7. Non-negotiable." He hit send, set the phone face down on the tray table, and closed his eyes. He did not know yet how far this was going to travel. He only knew that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had run out of patience for being invisible on purpose. In a row farther back, window seat, Paige Coleman had her phone propped against the seatback pocket in front of her, the red recording light blinking, and had been filming since the moment Lila's voice first cut through the cabin with, "I'm going to need you to move." Paige ran a small skincare business out of Columbus with a substantial following, who mostly wanted product reviews, and had never once planned to use her platform for anything like this. But she recognized the tone in Lila's voice within the first few words. The tone of someone who had already decided the outcome before the conversation started. And something in her chest had gone cold and clear and certain. By the time the slap landed, her Instagram Live had thousands of viewers. By the time Lila walked back toward the galley, it had many more. Near the galley curtain, Elena Price stood with her back against the beverage cart, both hands pressed flat against the metal to keep them from shaking. She'd worked under Lila for a stretch of time. She had watched Lila pull a black family out of an exit row for safety reasons that never applied to anyone else. She had watched Lila tell a gate agent more than once to use your judgment when it came to seating certain passengers away from the front. She had told herself every single time that it wasn't her place, that Lila was old school, that saying something would cost her a job. She needed to make her student loan payments. She had never said anything. Watching a welt rise on a man's face because he wouldn't give up a seat he'd paid for, Elena felt for the first time the actual weight of every time she hadn't spoken. It sat in her stomach like something swallowed whole years ago and never digested. She picked up the intercom handset. Her hand hovered over the button. She set it back down. Not yet, she told herself. Soon. Sterling Ashby did not hesitate at all. Hey, his voice cut through the cabin, low but hard. What in the hell was that? Lila turned, her customer service mask flickering back into place for half a second, out of pure habit. Sir, this is a crew matter. I need you to remain seated. You just hit a passenger. I was being aggressive. He hadn't moved. He hadn't raised his voice. I watched the whole thing. Sterling's jaw was... You want to explain to me what part of sitting still and folding his hands counts as aggressive? Sir, if you continue to interfere with cabin crew, I will have you removed for a federal violation. The threat worked the way it had worked on countless passengers before her. Sterling sat back, jaw still tight, but silent. Federal offense. Everyone knew the rule, and Lila had learned exactly how to weaponize it. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, standing there with her pulse still hammering from her own hand, connecting with someone else's face, was that several rows back a phone was still recording, and before long a name she'd never bothered to learn properly was going to detonate through every terminal and boardroom in the country. She walked to the galley, poured herself a cup of water she didn't drink, and told herself the story she needed to be true. He refused a direct order. He was disruptive. He provoked me. She believed every word of it. That belief was about to cost her everything. A short while later, she walked back down the aisle with a printed passenger manifest and stopped beside seat 2A. I'm marking you as a security threat, she said, clicking her pen. Final chance to cooperate before we land. Everett looked at the manifest, then at her. You already have my name. You checked my ticket twice and you just tore it in half. I'm asking again, Everett Hale. She wrote it down. The name meant nothing to her. Why would it? She didn't read shareholder filings. She didn't follow freight and logistics trade publications. She had no reason to know that the man she had just slapped, humiliated, and threatened to have arrested, held a significant stake of Continental Crest Airlines' outstanding stock, and that his company handled the majority of the airline's ground freight contracts nationwide. She clicked her pen shut and walked away. Everett didn't open his eyes again until the descent began. Captain Nathaniel Foss stepped out of the cockpit because Elena Price had finally, after arguing with herself for a long stretch, picked up the intercom and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Captain, we have a situation in the forward cabin. Lead crew struck a passenger." Foss had flown commercial for decades. He'd handled drunk passengers, a mid-flight cardiac arrest, one bomb threat that turned out to be a forgotten carry-on, and a man who'd tried to open an emergency exit at cruising altitude. He had never once handled a crew member physically assaulting someone in the cabin. He walked through this curtain and saw it immediately. A man in seat 2A with a visible welt darkening on his left cheek, 2 torn halves of a boarding pass sitting on the armrest, and Lila Sloan standing in the aisle with her arms crossed like she was guarding a checkpoint. "Lila, what happened?" He refused a seating reassignment and became aggressive. "I had to de-escalate." Foss looked at Everett, who sat with his hands folded, laptop closed, face calm except for the bruise spreading across it. "Sir, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Everett said. "I'd like her name and badge number for the record, formally." "You already have it," Lila snapped. "And when we land, security is going to want to talk to you, not me." Foss held up a hand. "Galley." Behind the curtain, the conversation lasted under 2 minutes. "Did you hit him?" he provoked. "Did you hit him, Lila?" A pause, then quieter. It was a reaction. A seated man with his hands in his lap provoked you into striking him across the face. "You weren't out there. You didn't see the way he looked at me. Like he had some kind of right to—" "He has every right. You checked his ticket yourself. Twice." Foss's voice didn't rise, which somehow made it worse. "You're relieved of cabin duties for the remainder of this flight. Sit in the jump seat. Don't speak to any passenger. This is going to corporate the moment we land, and I expect you understand what that means." Lila's face went white. Not with shame. Not yet. But with the dawning recognition that the story she'd been telling herself, the one where she was right, where the man in old sneakers was the problem, was not going to be the story anyone else believed. Back in the cabin, the silence had changed texture. It had been the passive, don't-get-involved quiet of people minding their own business. Now, it had turned into something heavier. The specific discomfort of people who had watched something and done nothing, and were only now beginning to understand what their nothing had cost. On Paige Coleman's phone, the live viewer count climbed high. The clip had already been screen-recorded and reposted across multiple platforms before she'd even ended the stream. A hashtag was forming on its own. Seat 2A. Everett opened his phone. Several missed calls from Victor Callahan. One text. "Board confirmed for tonight. All 7 members." "What's the agenda?" He typed back. "Full exit. Contract termination and equity divestment. Both on the table. No half measures." He looked out the window at the wing, catching morning light somewhere over Montana, folded his hands again, and waited for the plane to land. Brendan Hurst, chief executive of Continental Crest Airlines, was asleep at his home outside Fort Worth when his phone began ringing in the early hours. He ignored the first 2 calls. By the third, his wife elbowed him hard enough to wake him fully. Dozens of missed calls, multiple texts, several from his head of communications, 2 from the board chair, and 1 from a number he didn't recognize that read simply, "Check Twitter." Hearst didn't use social media personally. He opened the app anyway, typed the airline's name into the search bar, and felt his stomach drop through the mattress. The top result was a short clip. A white flight attendant striking a black man across the face in a first-class cabin. Posted hours earlier. Tens of millions of views. The comments were a wall of fire. Boycott. Fire her. Name her. Sue them. He called his head of communications, Renee Fisher. She'd been awake for hours already. How bad? Category 5, Brendan. Every network is running it. The attendant's name is already public. Lila Sloan. Years with us. The hashtag's been trending for hours. Multiple sitting state legislators have called for a boycott. Do we know anything about the passenger? Any history? Any... Brendan. Renee's voice dropped. Everett Hale is the founder and CEO of Ironclad Logistics Holdings. Hearst knew the name. Everyone in aviation logistics knew the name. Ironclad handles the majority of our ground freight, Renee continued. The contract is worth roughly $140 million a year. And Brendan, his firm holds a substantial stake of our stock. He's our largest individual shareholder. The silence on the line lasted several long seconds. Hearst counted every one of them. You're telling me, he said slowly, that one of our flight attendants slapped our single largest shareholder across the face on camera in front of tens of millions of people. That's what I'm telling you. Hearst hung up, walked to his bathroom, and gripped the edge of the sink until his knuckles went white. Staring at a man in the mirror who had navigated fuel crises and a pandemic, and had never once, until that moment, looked like he was about to lose. Later that morning, he called Everett Hale directly. A woman answered. Mr. Hale is aware of your call. He's not available. I've been instructed to relay the following. Ironclad Logistics is initiating termination of all freight contracts with Continental Crest Airlines, effective in 30 days under the Reputational Misconduct Clause. Ironclad Capital Partners will begin divesting its full equity position, beginning at market open this morning. He can't do that. That stock alone will... Mr. Hale's position is that Continental Crest's failure to maintain basic standards of human decency toward a paying passenger constitutes material breach of the values clause in the investment charter. This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Hearst. It's a notification. The line went dead. When trading opened on Wall Street, Ironclad Capital Partners began selling its Continental Crest position in large, systematic blocks. Analysts noticed the volume spike within minutes. Headlines caught up within the hour. Airline's largest shareholder dumps stake following assault of passenger on camera. By midday, Continental Crest stock had dropped sharply. Tens of millions in market capitalization gone before lunch. By the closing bell, the total loss stood at $41 million, and additional institutional investors had begun quietly trimming their own positions. Unwilling to be the last ones holding shares in a company that appeared to be actively burning down its own reputation in real time. In his Detroit office on the 9th floor, overlooking a skyline he'd grown up 2 miles from, Everett sat with a cup of black coffee and a stack of morning headlines. His phone held hundreds of unread messages. He hadn't responded to a single interview request. On his desk sat the small spiral notebook. He opened it to the page with Lila Sloan's name, badge number, and the time she'd struck him. He read it once, closed it, and put it in the drawer. He didn't need it anymore. The whole country had the footage. Lila Sloan was terminated the following day. There was no quiet meeting with HR, no soft-spoken conversation, and a box of tissues. Continental Crest's legal team drafted the termination letter early that morning, and emailed it to her personal account before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. 3 paragraphs. Gross misconduct. Violation of the passenger anti-discrimination policy. Full cooperation with a criminal assault investigation opened after Everett's legal counsel filed a formal complaint the morning after the flight. Lila read the email twice, then called her union representative. He didn't pick up. She called again. Voicemail. 3rd time he answered. I saw the video, Lila. That video doesn't show the whole. I watched the full, unedited live stream. The one where you called him a security threat while his hands stayed folded in his lap the entire time. I can't help you. Nobody can help you with what's on that tape. She sat on the edge of her bed in Blue Ash, Ohio, still in her uniform, and watched her name spread across every platform she'd ever half ignored her teenage daughter using. Her high school yearbook photo surfaced within hours, captioned, "This is her." By early afternoon, local police confirmed a formal assault investigation. Lila turned herself in with a lawyer she'd found through a quick internet search. The booking photo, taken at a precinct not far from her house, was on national television before her fingerprints had fully dried. 3rd-degree assault. A misdemeanor on paper, a life sentence in the court of public reputation. Her neighbor of many years, a man who'd waved to her every morning over the fence, left a note in her mailbox that said nothing kind. The coffee shop 2 blocks from her house, where she'd been a regular for years, quietly stopped serving her. No confrontation, just a manager who suddenly found reasons to be busy whenever she walked in. Every major airline alliance in North America had seen the footage within a day. Her name became, within the industry, a verb. A warning passed between flight attendants in training sessions. Don't sloan a passenger. She would never work in commercial aviation again. Brendan Hurst held a press conference that same day, flanked by his communications chief and a diversity officer, whose position had, until that morning, been largely ceremonial. He read from prepared remarks. Abhorrent, unacceptable, a full review of cabin crew training, a $2 million commitment to inclusion initiatives. The first question from the press corps ended the conference. Mr. Hurst, were you aware at the time you issued your first statement that the passenger your employee assaulted is the founder of your largest freight contractor and your single biggest individual shareholder? Hurst's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out. His communications director stepped to the podium, grabbed the microphone, and closed the press conference. The clip of Hurst standing frozen behind the airline's own logo went viral within the hour, reposted with captions that had nothing to do with sympathy. Days later, Continental Crest had lost additional stock value. Multiple major corporate travel agencies, each serving its biggest accounts, suspended it from their preferred carrier list. Meanwhile, competing airlines reached out to Ironclad Logistics for exploratory freight contracts within days. Everett didn't have to pitch a single one of them. The footage had already made the case. Partnering with the man Lila Sloan had slapped had become, overnight, the fastest way for any airline to prove it wasn't Continental Crest. Sterling Ashby went on a national morning show several days after the flight, sitting in a gray suit, counting the entire sequence from the double ticket check to the slap. His account was calm, specific, and devastating. I was 3 feet away in 2C, he said. I watched a woman decide a man didn't belong before he'd said a single word to her. And I watched a cabin full of people, myself included, for the first stretch of it, do absolutely nothing about it. That's the part I can't get past. Not what she did, what the rest of us didn't do. The clip was viewed millions of times. The Federal Aviation Administration opened a formal review of Continental Crest's crew conduct policies. The Department of Transportation requested years of internal discrimination complaints. 2 former flight attendants came forward independently with their own accounts of being pressured by Lila, specifically, to seat certain passengers away from the front of the cabin, regardless of ticket class. What had looked for years like one occasional bad day turned out to be a pattern that management had simply never bothered to investigate, because nobody with the standing to be believed had ever complained loudly enough. On a later day, Everett posted a short video to a personal account that had, until that week, only a few thousand followers. It now had millions. He sat in a plain room. No logo, no suit. The same gray hoodie he'd worn on the flight. The welt on his cheek had faded to a yellowish shadow. He didn't cover it. Days ago, a flight attendant decided a man in old sneakers didn't belong in first class, he said. She never asked what I do for a living. She looked at my clothes, made a decision, and acted on it. What happened to that airline stock afterward? That was business. I don't keep my money in companies that treat people the way I was treated. That's not anger. That's arithmetic. But I'm not here to talk about stock prices. I'm here to announce something. The Hale Foundation for Travel Dignity. $6 million, starting today, for free. Legal representation for anyone discriminated against while traveling. In an airport, on a plane, in a hotel lobby, anywhere. If you were treated as less than human because of your skin, your accent, or your clothes, and you couldn't afford a lawyer, we will find you one, and we will pay for it. The video was viewed tens of millions of times in its first day. The foundation received thousands of inquiries in its first week. Elena Price resigned from Continental Crest shortly after the flight. She wrote a private email through Ironclad's General Inquiries line. It read, in full, "I should have picked up that intercom the first minute, not much later. I didn't, and I have to live with that. But I don't want to live with it quietly. If there's anything I can do, I'm here." Everett read it twice, then called her himself. Weeks later, she was hired as lead consultant for a new passenger dignity training program. Ironclad began licensing to airlines and hotel chains nationwide. Within months, multiple carriers had signed on. Elena stood in front of rooms full of crew members and told them, plainly, what she'd seen on that flight, and what she'd almost let herself get away with not doing about it. Paige Coleman's following grew from 150,000 to over 2 million within a short stretch. She used the platform to start a non-profit training bystanders on how to safely document discrimination in public spaces without escalating danger to the person being targeted. Sterling Ashby quietly donated $500,000 to the Hale Foundation. He didn't announce it. Everett found out through the foundation's finance office and sent him a handwritten card. 2 sentences. "You spoke when it would have been easier not to. That cost you nothing and meant everything." Continental Crest survived, but barely. Brendan Hurst was replaced within months. The board brought in Vivian Marsh, a former chief operating officer at a rival carrier known industry-wide for zero tolerance on institutional bias and for flying coach unannounced. To see for herself how crews actually treated passengers. In her first stretch of time, she personally reviewed years of internal complaint records that had previously gone nowhere. She terminated several more employees, not for anything as dramatic as a slap, but for the smaller, quieter patterns. The unnecessary bag searches, the seat reassignments that always seemed to target the same kind of passenger, the things that never went viral, but left the same bruise over and over, invisibly, for years. Months after the flight, on a gray afternoon, Lila Sloan sat across a folding table from a court-appointed mediator in a converted community center in Blue Ash, Ohio, as part of the restorative agreement her attorney had negotiated in lieu of additional criminal proceedings. A condition that required her to write and deliver in person a full account of what she had done. Everett had agreed to attend. He hadn't decided, driving there, whether he would say anything at all. Lila looked smaller than she had on the plane. Her hands shook as she unfolded a single sheet of paper. "I told myself for years that I was protecting something," she read, voice cracking halfway through the first line. "Standards. Order. I never once asked myself what I was actually protecting, or who I was protecting it from. I looked at you and decided who you were before you said a word. And when you didn't perform the fear I expected, I hit you. Not because you provoked me, because I couldn't stand being wrong in front of a plane full of people, and I made you pay for that instead of admitting it." She stopped, swallowed hard. "I've spent months telling myself it wasn't as bad as the video made it look. It was worse. I know that now. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just needed you to hear me say I was wrong out loud, without an excuse attached to it." Everett listened without interrupting. When she finished, he didn't say, "It's okay," because it was, and he'd never once been in the business of pretending things were smaller than they were. He said only, "Thank you for saying that," without adding a "but" to the end of it. And then he stood and left, and didn't look back at her from the doorway, because there was nothing left in that room he needed to carry out with him. Everett Hale went back to his life. He still ran ironclad. He still flew commercial. Business class. Same hoodie. Same sneakers. Same duffel bag. The only difference now was that occasionally a flight attendant recognized him, brought him water before he asked, and sometimes leaned down and said quietly, "Thank you for what you did." He would nod. He never said, "You're welcome," just a nod, because he understood something most people still hadn't learned. What happened on that flight should never have required a billionaire to fix it. It shouldn't have taken $41 million to prove that a man deserved to sit in the seat he'd paid for. But it did. And that said far more about the world than it ever said about Everett Hale. He still wears the watch. It still doesn't tell time. He still isn't planning on taking it off.